Good morning. Time now 10 a.m. In the morning in Tokyo, Friday, April 9th, 2021. Welcome to another edition of the World Bank Group Morning Seminar organized by the World Bank Group Tokyo office. My name is Koichi Omori. I am Senior External Affairs Officer of the World Bank. Um, we organize so many interesting seminars starting at 8 o'clock in the morning in Japan Standard Time. Something wrong here. Sorry. All right. We have two speakers connecting from Washington and Mumbai this morning. Let me introduce two of them. First, Dina Abu Gaida, Lead Education Specialist for Middle East and North Africa region in the Education Global Practice. Dina is also the focal point for fragile conflict and violence setting in the Education Global Practice. Dina is joining us from Washington this morning. Dina, good evening to you.
Good morning to you.
Great. Thank you very much for joining us this morning from Washington. And then we have Karishma Silva, the economist in the Education Global Practice. Karishma is joining us from Mumbai, India. So very good morning to you, Karishma. Thanks for joining us.
Good morning. Hi.
Great. Dina and Karishma are two key authors of a report by the World Bank and United Nations High Commissioners for Refugees, UNHCR, titled The Global Cost for Inclusive Refugee Education, issued on February 25 this year. We listen to Dina and Karishma to present the main point of the report in the next 30-40 minutes. Then I'll read questions from our viewers, and thank you very much for sending your questions already. Please keep sending your questions even during the seminar. I'll read your questions, asking Dina and Karishma to respond after their presentation. So now I'd like to ask Dina and Karishma to come in and then start your presentation. So Dina and Karishma, over to you.
Thank you very much again, Koichi, for the introduction. Good morning to everyone connected. Nice to be with you. As Koichi mentioned, this is a joint report between the World Bank and UNHCR, and we recently launched it in February. And in fact, this is our first complete presentation of the findings of the report. So it's very nice to be here with you today. Go ahead, Karishma, next slide, thank you. So as you all, I think, probably already are aware, the numbers of refugees in our world today are unprecedented and continue to rise. So we believe that as of the end of 2019, there were 80 million people in forced displacement all over the world, 26 million of whom were refugees. 20 million of these refugees are under the mandate of our partners in this report, the UNHCR. Another 5.6 million are Palestinian refugees under the mandate of another UN organization, UNRWA, and they are not included in the costing of this report. The remainder of the forcibly displaced 80 million, we have around 45.7 million who are internally displaced, so within their own countries. We have another 4.2 million asylum seekers, and then there are the 3.6 million Venezuelans who are displaced. It's important to note that half of all refugees, so those 26 million that, or the 20.4 million that we're talking about under UNHCR's mandate, are below the age of 18. So they are of school-going age, and they are at 70% of them are in situations of protracted crises, meaning that they are not refugees for 1 or 2 months, but in fact for many years. And that 85% of the world's forcibly displaced are hosted in developing countries, which is of course a very large share. In other words, where the developing world is the one that is stepping up to support these forcibly displaced. The Provision of quality education is therefore really of paramount importance to refugee populations. As I already mentioned, we're talking about a situation where the refugees are refugees for long period of time, and so for the children, we're talking about children being refugees for the entirety of their school-going years. Without having an adequate response to the education of refugees, we're talking therefore about a massive loss in human capital. And access to quality education, as we all know, is important for ensuring future livelihoods, for the economic growth of both the host countries, and for rebuilding of the countries of origin of refugees. It is also important in terms of actually providing this type of psychosocial support that refugees need, because they have to cope with the trauma of forced displacement. So there are many, many reasons then for supporting refugees, and it's not, it's important to remember that we are all committed as a world to the achievement of the Sustainable Development Goals, and goal number 4, and education cannot be achieved without ensuring that refugees also access quality education. And last but not least, of course, there are human rights that refugees have and that are enshrined in, for example, the 1951 Refugee Convention, the 2016 New York Declaration, and most recently in the 2018 Global Compact on Refugees. Now, of course, educating refugees has its challenges. Unfortunately, what we observe right now is that enrollment rates for refugee children are lower than the global comparator enrollment rates. And it gets worse the higher the level of education. So the gap at the primary level is between an enrollment rate of 77% for refugees versus 91% globally. By the time we get to secondary education, the gap is much bigger, enrollment rates of only 31% for refugees compared to the 84% globally. And again, at tertiary, it's a very large gap, 3% for refugees and 37% globally. There are many barriers and challenges that refugees face to accessing quality education, both on the supply as well as on the demand side. On the supply side, it's possible that host countries have legal, social barriers in place to including refugees in their education systems. There could be an absence of costed national plans for including refugees. The host country itself could have a poorly financed education system, so it's unable to absorb yet more students. And that could also be literally in terms of the physical infrastructure, not enough schools, not enough classroom space, or the human resources, not enough teachers. And then, of course, as we can imagine, there are needs that refugees have above and beyond perhaps the average host country student, such as remedial instruction because they've missed schooling for a certain period of time, or the psychosocial support that I mentioned earlier, or maybe they speak a different language than the host country language. So these are all possible supply side challenges. On the demand side, of course, we are talking about refugees who are likely to be poor. So any additional direct, indirect opportunity costs of schooling will be very difficult for them to bear. If there are any, payments to be made towards textbooks, or maybe for transportation to school, that's going to be very difficult for the refugee family to come up with. The poverty could lead families to employ negative coping strategies, like having to send their children out to work rather than sending them to school. It's possible that refugee children don't have proper documentation to indicate how much they've already learned in their home country. And so what they what they already have accomplished is not recognized in the host country, and it's difficult for them to then build on it and continue with their schooling. There are situations where refugee children face bullying, and so the kids don't want to go to school. And then, of course, refugee children may look to the future and see that the labor markets in the countries they're in are not allowing them to work, and so they may think, why should I study if I can't, if it won't get me a better job anyway? So all of these challenges are very important, and they are further exacerbated, unfortunately, we suspect, though we still have to learn more, by the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on the world as a whole, on education systems in particular. Now, the way forward is the sort of the rubric, the framework that we have used in our report is the one of inclusive education. What do we mean by this? So historically, refugee education has been addressed more through separate or parallel systems, as if, the refugees are in camps and the schools are set up in these camps, let's say, because, the assumption is refugees will be in the host country only temporarily. But then, as we've already mentioned, there are now larger and larger numbers of refugees, and they are staying longer and longer in host countries. So now the thinking is that we really need to be pushing for inclusive education systems. And what we mean by inclusive education systems are systems in the host countries, the education systems in the host countries themselves simply integrate, well, maybe not so simply, but integrate refugee children within them. And so it's not that you're setting up separate schools in camps and things. No, you're allowing the refugee child to join the children in the host country, in their classrooms, and the child will therefore be facing the same cost and quality constraints that the host country child is facing in this classroom, as well as benefiting from the investments made by the host country in the education system as a whole. Now, this is also a way that we think this inclusive approach not only provides more sustainable solution, and we think it's more cost effective to the refugee education challenge, but it also means that the host communities themselves benefit from the resources that development partners are deploying towards refugee education, because very often the host communities themselves are underserved and disadvantaged. So when development partners are supporting refugee education in an inclusive manner, the host community schools also can be tapping into some of this support. So how do we go about then measuring the cost of educating all refugee children through inclusive education through national systems? Because we've said we're relying on the host country systems, we start with the host countries per student, or if you like, the average fiscal cost, which is simply the public spending by the host country divided by the public enrollment. And we differentiate here by level of education, primary, secondary, tertiary. Actually, I should say that our costing is limited to 1 year of pre-primary, primary, and secondary. So we do not cost the education of refugee children at the tertiary level in this report. So again, we start with the host country per student cost. Because of the challenges, special challenges that I mentioned earlier that refugees face, we think that the refugee students will require additional support. And this could be a whole range of different support, whether it's remedial classes, whether it's language instruction, etc. So we add a markup to the unit cost of the host country student. And we say that this markup is different by education level, although we use the same markup across all countries where we're doing this calculation. And the markup is 20% for the pre-primary year and also for the primary years, and the markup is 35% for the secondary years. And for our pre-primary year, we are thinking about just 1 year before primary one. And here again, we often don't have the per student cost of that pre-primary year. So what we say is that pre-primary year is 30% more expensive than the primary years. And then we add the markup to that figure. So it's a standardized approach, starting with the unit cost from the host country itself. Then we say we're assuming the refugee numbers are going to stay the same throughout the period of our analysis. In other words, we don't account for refugees returning home or additional influx of refugees. And we use then a cohort flow approach to estimate the annual refugee student enrollment. And then we sum across pre-primary, primary, and secondary levels of education to come up with a summary figure. So the idea again is that since the refugee student is integrated, is part of the host country system, they face the same cost drivers and efficiency and quality constraints. In other words, we don't account for needing to improve quality of education in any way. The host country might have low quality, but the refugee student is going to get the same education as the host country student, whether it is low quality or not. And this was above and beyond sort of the calculations that we use in this report. And so this is the last slide that I'm going to present for now, and then I'm going to hand over to Karishma to go into a bit more details before she hands back to me to sum up. But in terms of the big ticket numbers, if you like, in terms of the main findings, we estimate that the average annual cost of educating all refugee students, from kindergarten through 12 years of education, through inclusive education in developing countries is 4.85 billion. And if we sum over the 13 years, that adds up to 63 billion. Again, this excludes the cost of educating Palestinian refugee children under the UN organization UNRWA. These may seem like big numbers, but we'll come back to sort of giving you an idea of how they fit into the overall financing of education by development partners. It's important to point out that the top 15 developing refugee host countries actually account for 3.7 billion, or over 75% of this annual financing envelope. So 15 developing host countries already would need 75% of this financing. And here we're talking about 2.1 billion going to Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan primarily for the Syrian refugees in those countries, 468 million in Colombia, Peru, and Ecuador, 461 million in Bangladesh, 421 million in Iran and Pakistan, and then 214 million in a series of sub-Saharan African countries. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Karishma to give you more details on the figures.
Thank you, Dina. I'm going to go through a breakdown of the cost that comprised that $4.85 billion figure. So the average cost of refugee education varies by income categorization and the level of education. So while the average unit cost for refugee education for each student is around $1,051 a year, in low-income countries, it's $171. In low-middle-income countries, it's $663. And in upper-middle-income countries, it's $2,085. So there's a large disparity between income categorization of the country, and that's largely driven by the underlying unit cost in the host country system. You'll also see that the cost for pre-primary, primary, and secondary varies largely. Of course, secondary education is more expensive to provide for the government to provide. And you'll see that the pre-primary costs are slightly higher than the primary costs. because we've added that 30% markup, which is driven by general trends globally, but also the need to improve quality of pre-primary education where it doesn't exist in many developing countries. Moving forward, the cost of secondary education accounts for 75% of this total 4.85 billion figure. So you'll see that pre-primary accounts for 50 million, primary about 1.1 billion, and secondary 3.6 billion. What it means is that that we need greater investment in the secondary subsector to complete this, to remove the bottlenecks to completing the whole K-12 education cycle. What we also find is that the annual cost of inclusive refugee education amounts to less than 5% of what countries are currently spending on primary and secondary education. So in 36 out of the 65 countries that we studied in this report, the cost of inclusive refugee education amounts to less than 1% of the primary and secondary education expenditure in the host country. There's of course variations by income categorization of the country. So in low income countries, it's about 4.7%. In lower middle income countries, it's 2.1%. And in upper middle income countries, it's 4.3%. Exceptions exist to this low share of what the refugee inclusive education costs amount to. And that's largely driven by countries that experience very large influxes of refugees, and also in countries where there has historically been low public expenditure on education. So apart from the 36 countries that have less than 1%, the ones on the largest distribution of the costs, we have Bangladesh at 11%, Uganda also at 11%, and Jordan at 16%. And then there's Lebanon and South Sudan. In Lebanon, we had a very large influx of refugees, but also the public education system only accounts for about 30% of total enrollment. In South Sudan as well, there was a large influx of refugees, but also public expenditure on education is very limited. So just a couple of graphs to show you the disparities in the annual cost of inclusive education as a percentage of current public expenditure. So this is for low-income countries where you'll see South Sudan is much higher than in the other countries. This is for low-middle-income countries where the average share is only 2.1% of total public expenditure on education. But it's larger in some countries than in others. And then finally, in upper middle income countries, the average is 4.3%, but it's skewed by countries like Turkey, Jordan, and Lebanon that have a large influx of Syrian refugees. Finally, we've broken down the cost of this 4.85 billion by income categorization and the share of school-age refugees that these countries host. And what we find is that focusing on or prioritizing investments in low and lower middle income countries accounts for almost half of all school-age refugees, more than half of school-age refugees. So there are about 51% of school-age refugees in low-income and lower-middle-income countries, and the share of the total cost of this 4.85 billion figure is about 20%. I'll go through a few of the limitations and the caveats with the methodology and this costing exercise. So firstly, as Dina mentioned, the refugee education coefficients that we add to the public unit cost of education, which is 20% for pre-primary and primary, and then 35% for secondary education, is uniform across all countries. We understand that refugee education programs might differ in each country, and that the cost of those would differ as well. but with very limited data on these programs, we've just assumed that it's uniform across all countries. As Dina also mentioned, we don't include the cost of improving the quality of education. So if the quality of education is low in some countries, and that's reflected in their unit cost of education, that's the base figure that we use in this report. It also provides a pre-COVID baseline of the fiscal costs. This is because there are very limited costs on, very limited data on the impact of COVID on public education expenditure, and also it's constantly evolving. Also, the provision of financial resources is a necessary but not sufficient condition for universal access and completion of education. So even where governments spend large amounts of funding on education, we still see a lot of out-of-school children. And then finally, this report doesn't substitute for national inclusive education planning. In fact, it encourages more countries to undertake an exercise to create costed national inclusive education plans. It's also not meant for cross-country comparisons. So our way forward on improving these estimates would be first to improve the reporting on unit costs of education provision by level of education. So even if when we merge data from the UNESCO UIS database, from World Bank education statistics, we cover only about 65% of countries globally. Very few countries report on, in a systematic way, public expenditure on education. We'd also, the database on refugee numbers is from the UNHCR. And while it's disaggregated by age, it only gives us certain age groups. And also it's not complete for some countries. Having more comprehensive data on that would improve our cost estimates. Finally, in addition, we've got, we would like to create a model where where countries could report on specific refugee education programs and how much they cost, so that we could have country-specific refugee education coefficients rather than the uniform numbers that we're using right now. Also, the cost of refugee education programs are likely to change from when there is an immediate response through humanitarian support and then also through a protracted crisis. For instance, language of instruction support might be required initially and then might be phased out, and similarly with other programs like remedial education. And then lastly, we'd like to improve the fiscal cost estimates by including some impact on COVID-19 on per student expenditures. And now I will hand back to Dina to go over some of the financing issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Karishma. So we're getting close to the end of the presentation. I hope we still have all of your attention. A few more slides only, and then Karishma will also show you a very important part of the report, a dashboard that she produced. So, okay, coming back to financing refugee education, our sense is that the financing for refugee education has largely been along the lines of what humanitarian aid looks like, meaning it's sort of responding to an emergency. It can be quite short term, it can be a little fragmented, and it's very specific for specific interventions, very often for parallel education systems rather than the national systems. Humanitarian aid is also very often simply dependent on the resources that can be mobilized for an emergency situation. So, you know, development partners voluntarily providing, not always very predictably providing financing, and unfortunately, very often not enough. Over the last 20 years, humanitarian appeals for education were only 50% funded on average. So this is not a very rosy picture, if you like. And now, in terms of the figures, the data that we have available indicate that the combination of humanitarian and development support to refugee education was about 800 million in 2016, which is when this exercise was last done on a comprehensive basis. Meanwhile, for 2019, education aid to education as a whole, not just for refugees, was on the order of $16 billion. So we're providing these two numbers for comparison purposes. Specifically, the 800 million for refugee education is a lot less, of course, than the 4.85 billion figure that we have estimated is necessary. So one might think, gosh, that is a very large leap then from the 800 million to the 4.85 billion. But if we put the 4.85 billion in the context of the 16 billion that are going to education as a whole, it becomes clear that it's not out of reach. It is very much within the broader annual education aid envelope. So where does this leave us in terms of sort of, what now, what next, our policy recommendations, if you like? We still see a very important need for addressing the challenges of the inadequate and inflexible and unpredictable financing of refugee education. There is, despite our report, as we mentioned, it's a standardized methodology. There's definitely a need for costed refugee and host community education response plans that have very much the country level data, have clear financing targets, resource mobilization plans, etc. There are also all sorts of new innovative financing instruments out there which haven't been put to use as much as one might wish, including the International Financing Facility for Education, the Global Concessional Financing Facility, donor guarantees, and even the World Bank's own window for host communities and refugees, and the refugee sub-window, about which I'll say more in a second. And then, given the fact that we are talking about inclusive education, about education that for refugees who will be living in host countries for many years, we need to move beyond the humanitarian response and strengthen the humanitarian development nexus and really sequence support so that development financing kicks in as quickly as possible once the humanitarian support starts to subside, or even in parallel, so that they can overlap and pick up one from the other. And similarly, then that would require strengthening the leadership and the partnerships between the development and the humanitarian actors. In terms of what the World Bank is doing in education in fragile and conflict settings, conflict-affected settings, I already referred to the IDA 18 refugee sub-window for refugees and host communities, which had an envelope of 2 billion under IDA 18, which is 2018 to 2020. Under IDA 19, we have again a window for host communities and refugees, 2.2 billion, 1 billion of which is dedicated to responding to the COVID-19 impact on refugees. The Global Concessional Financing Facility provides funding to make investments in refugee education more concessional, on more concessional terms for middle-income countries. So far, we see that about 15% of these refugee windows have 15% of their funding has gone to education, and about 12% of the Global Concessional Financing Facility has gone to education. In addition, of course, the bank has a portfolio of over 1.1 billion in IDA in education projects in fragile states. and analytical work that is done both by the bank and supported through the joint World Bank UNHCR Joint Data Center, which is based in Copenhagen. And we also have a partnership in place that came out of the 2019 Global Refugee Forum between the bank, Education Cannot Wait, ECW, and the Global Partnership for Education, GPE, all of whom wish to coordinate better to identify funding gaps in host countries for refugee education and to try and coordinate better to close those funding gaps. With that, I think I'm handing back to Karishma so she can also show you the dashboard that she has produced that allows individual countries to look at their own figures that underlie the findings in the report and to try and simulate some different scenarios. So over to Karishma.
Thanks, Dina. I'm just going to switch out of PowerPoint and into Excel, which is what this dashboard is. And so what you'll see is that this dashboard contains data on all the 65 countries that are studied in this report. It provides data on the number of refugees by categorization from the UNHCR database. And then it breaks it down by the population aged 5 to 11 and then 12 to 17. So pre-primary and primary, and then primary, and then secondary. It also gives you from existing databases the unit cost for a local host community student for primary education and secondary education. These are some of the standard assumptions of the costing model, where we have 6 years of primary education and 1 year of pre-primary, and so 7 years in total, and then 6 years of secondary education. This is based on the breakdown of the population groups we have from UNHCR. We've also assumed that repetition rate at primary and secondary is 0, and that these are the refugee coefficients we talked about for additional refugee-specific education programs. So what this dashboard allows you to do is to go through each country and look at the data that we have for each of them with existing data, with existing assumptions and data. But it also allows you to change and modify some of this. So for instance, if the amount of, if Bangladesh, for instance, decides to reach about half the number of refugee students that are in the country, so instead of 300,000, they had about 150,000, it would then change the total cost of refugee education here. They could also say that given that they want to make improvements in quality education and there are some funds attached to that, that the unit cost for native students increases or, for instance, doubles to $300 per primary student, and then say about $3,000 for secondary education. This also impacts the total cost of refugee education, how much would need to be allocated each year. So this dashboard accompanies the report, gives data for all countries that are in it, and allows you to make even changes to the standard assumptions. So for instance, in some countries, the number of years of pre-primary and primary education might differ, repetition rates might be higher, the refugee coefficients might vary by different levels of education as well. It might be different from the figures that we've used. And all of this data can be changed on the dashboard. We've done some sensitivity analysis around the 4.85 billion figure that changes these refugee coefficients and also assumes that the unit cost of education for a native student increases over time. That still gives us a plus or minus 10% range on the 4.85 billion figure. But this dashboard allows countries to do that for each individual country. Thank you.
I think with that, we've completed our presentation, Koichi. So I think over to you again, right?
Okay, thank you very much, Dina and Kashma, for your presentation on the report. So from now on, I would like to read some questions that we received in advance and also during the presentation from our audience. So let me start with this one. This is a question from Yamada-san. Thank you very much for your question. This report was published jointly by the World Bank and UNHCR. How would both institutions plan to utilize the result of the analysis by the report for enhancing policy dialogue among the leaders of developed countries and developing countries? Do you have plans to organize international forum where this issue will be discussed? How would you collaborate with other regional MDBs and UN organizations? Thank you for your question. And let me actually add one more point on this question. We are now in the middle of spring meetings of the World Bank and IMF. So if you also are planning something around this topic during the spring meetings, actually, that'd be great if you can just talk about it. So I would like to ask Dina and Karishma to come in on those points. Thank you.
Sure, thank you for that question. So as I mentioned, actually the report was launched in February, and this is our first full presentation of it. Maybe I'll start with answering the second question first here, which is that on Monday, the Canadian Executive Director's Office in the World Bank is hosting, in fact, a session on, showcasing the findings of this report. Canada was interested in hosting, and that's part of the spring meetings that are happening right now. Canada is interested in hosting this session because Canada has just launched its own initiative on promoting refugee education. And when they heard about this report, they thought it was an interesting report to showcase for them and to get a conversation going. So the session is not going to be like this one, which is quite technical, if you like, where we had a chance to go into quite a bit of detail on the methodology and the exact numbers in the report. Instead, we will, our Vice President for Human Development, Manta Murthy, will be giving the highlights of the report during this session, and the Canadian hosts have arranged for their own Minister for International Aid and Cooperation, I think GAC, Global Aid Coordination. I'm not sure what the acronym stands for now, but it's their own Minister, Karine Gould, who will be present and who will be part of there will be 2 panel discussions where issues like precisely what the first question asked will be discussed, how to take forward the findings of this report. What does this mean in terms of sharing the cost of refugee education between host countries, who are very often almost, the lion's share, they bear currently the lion's share of the responsibility for hosting refugees, and how can this burden, if you like, or responsibility be shared between host countries and other countries, because it's a global public good to have these refugees be educated. So that there will be panel discussions that include also representation from Colombia. We're hoping also to get representation from Uganda, although that's not confirmed yet. And this will be the first time that we will present our findings in an international context like this. We will follow up. There are multiple configurations where we can follow up with, related to education and emergency actors. I mentioned ECW and GPE, who have a role. They are also part of different combinations of education sector actors who meet regularly, to whom we also hope to present both in the humanitarian as well as the development sphere. I don't know if Karishma wants to add, or if we should, Karishma, come in.
Thanks, Dina. I just wanted to add very quickly that we had an opportunity to present this methodology at the technical workshop organized with a bunch of host countries, as well as the UNHCR, through the Global Refugee Forum technical workshops. And that is a very useful forum to get more host countries in, get their inputs into costing, and then also how to take this work forward. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much for your responses. Let me read a comment which was sent by the Professor Yoshino during the presentation. Thank you, Yoshino-sensei, for your comment. Thank you very much for nice presentation. Refugees need a lot of assistance, such as shelter, food, medical care, education, etc. Balanced spending in many items will be needed to assist refugees. School education is well presented today. Vocational education will be needed to assist their skill development in addition to school education. So these are the comments from the Yoshino-sensei. Thank you very much for your comment. And let me continue read the question from Mori-san, which was sent in advance to us. If we can create a system that children who have a good level of understanding can play the role of a teacher and teach other children, we can speed up the process of increasing the number of local teachers and increase the motivation of the student. What do you think about this idea? So let me ask Dina and Karishma to come in. If you also have a comment, responding comments to Professor Yoshino's vocational education point, that would be great. So I'll ask Dina and Karishma to come in. Thank you.
Thank you. So yeah, I mean, I think Karishma might have more to say on the vocational education one. I just want to say that in this report, it is primary and secondary. Vocational, insofar as it's post-secondary, we didn't discuss here, but I agree fully with the professor that vocational education is an important avenue for refugee education. And I know that there are multiple actors, including regional NGOs, for example, in the Middle East, who are working with Syrian refugees to promote vocational education training programs for these refugees. Al Ghurair Foundation is one of them, based in the Emirates. So it is an area that people see the potential for, but probably it's not sufficiently addressed. I would agree with that. In terms of children, sort of the idea of having children who may be more advanced teach other children to provide, I guess, additional instructors for refugee children. I think the assumption here is that there is a lack of instructors, where in fact, in many instances, we do have, teachers. The refugees themselves are very often are teachers. And for example, again, I'm more familiar with the Middle East because that's where I work now. In Jordan, for example, the refugee camps in Jordan for Syrian refugees, there are Jordanian teachers and very often also a Syrian teacher in the classroom teaching the refugee children, simply because the Syrian teacher is more familiar with what these children know from having come from the Syrian education system, etc. So my point here is that we don't necessarily see a lack of availability of teaching resources, so that we would need to rely on children teaching children. And then, of course, there are, child labor concerns to take into account, etc., right? Because, children have to be above certain age in order to be employed, right? So instead, sometimes what happens is that host countries have legal requirements in terms of who can be a teacher in their country. So, for example, in Jordan, these Syrian teachers, although they are fully competent, are not considered fully teachers according to the civil service law of Jordan, and they can only be assistant teachers to the Jordanian teachers in the classroom. Karishma, if you want to add, please.
Thanks, Dina. I just wanted to talk a little bit about spending across different sectors in addition to education. So the education was the first sector for which this costing exercise has been done. But at the technical workshop from the Global Refugee Forum, there were many sectors under consideration for such a costing exercise, including health, housing, security, water. Together, the workshop decided that that forum decided that we would start with education. But it's certainly important that all of these sectors are costed. And this was the first step towards, or sort of the first step towards having more equitable responsibility sharing, would be having estimates of what this cost looks like. So education is the first step, and there's certainly the hope that we do it across different sectors as well. Thanks.
Thank you very much for responses. Let me continue read another question from Mori-san, sent just before the seminar. In the table of annual cost of inclusive refugees education, South Sudan in low-income countries and Lebanon in upper middle-income countries have outstandingly high percentage, around 60%. And about this, is this because they have few of their own youth, or what's the reason behind these big numbers for those two countries? So that's one clarification question. And then let me continue read the several questions from the anonymous participant. Thank you very much for sending your question. Where is the line to divide the capacity building and building systems to provide for specific education need into unit cost for refugee education? That's one. Another question from the same participant viewers: how to improve the quality of education for students and refugees in hosting countries where learning opportunities are not enough secured and resources for education are not enough, and situation going to be worsened by the COVID-19. So those are the two questions from the anonymous participant. I would like to ask Dina and Karishma to come in to quickly respond. And I see some other questions posted on YouTube. So we'll go one more round and then we'll wrap up the session. So Dina and Karishma, please.
Thank you. I'm going to leave the South Sudan and Lebanon question entirely to Karishma, so she can get into the details. She mentioned an explanation in her presentation, but she can get into more detail. If I understood the second question correctly, have we included consideration of capacity building of teachers into the unit cost estimates? Okay, so the unit cost estimates are based on two summary figures. One is the total public spending on education on public schools in the host country, and then the other is the total enrollment in public schools in the host country. So insofar as the host country spends money on teacher training, etc., that would be part of the unit cost calculation. Now, if the question refers to sort of additional teacher training needed in order to address the unique needs of refugees, that would be absorbed in our markup coefficient that we have introduced, that I mentioned, which is 20% for pre-primary and primary, and 35% for secondary. So any that markup coefficient is a catch-all for anything like additional training for teachers to cater to the needs of refugees, but it can also be, even conditional cash transfers to encourage refugee households to send their children to school, etc. It's a catch-all ratio that we have used just to be able to do the standardized methodology across all the relevant host countries. Now, the question of how to improve the quality of education, especially post-COVID-19, that is the ultimate question. That is the big question that the whole existence of the education global practice is for. And the point that trying to make with this report is, I guess, you know, integrate the refugees into the host country systems and improve the quality of the system as a whole, both for host country students as well as refugees. How to go about doing that is, of course, going to depend on, you know, specific needs of each country. We have a whole framework that the Education Global Practice in the World Bank uses that includes looking at teachers, looking at basic sort of learning environment. It includes looking at assessment. It includes looking at the governance of the education system. So there are multiple pillars that we rely on to answer that question. I'll stop here and see if Karishma wants to add.
Thanks, Dina. I'll just address the questions on Lebanon and South Sudan quickly. So the thing that drives up the share of public expenditure, refugee inclusive education costs as a share of public expenditure is first the number of refugees themselves, and then second, the existing expenditure on primary and secondary education within these countries. So in the case of Lebanon, the number of refugees was around 930,000, which is 930,000, yeah, which is a huge influx. And the population of school-age children compared to public enrollment was nearly double. Was nearly the same. So that public enrollment, public school system needed to expand almost double overnight. And that's because in Lebanon, only about 30% of children are enrolled in the public education system. In South Sudan, it's mostly because of the existing expenditure levels in public education. So compared to, while the refugee numbers were quite large, around 300,000, public expenditure in South Sudan on education has been around 1.5% of GDP. Which is substantially lower than like a global average of about 4%. Thanks.
Thank you very much. As promised, let me read one more question posted by Kanda-san on the YouTube chat, and then I ask Dina and Karishma to give us a final remarks from your end. Do you possibly know any general data around the likelihood for refugee students to finish schools when there is enrollment opportunity compared to the likelihood for host community students? My question concerns how the potential investment can offer quality education for refugees kids to actually learn and finish schools as opposed to just having enrollment opportunity. I say this partly because I heard the cost for the improvement of the quality of education is not included in the report. So those are the comments posted by Kanda-san during the presentation. So I would like to invite Dina and Karishma to partly responding to those questions, but also give us a final thought, and then we wrap up the seminar. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that question. So and the likelihood here, I guess that, and in other words, I think what the question is, do we know the completion rates, maybe for refugee versus host country students? The quick answer that I will have to give here now is no, but we have shown you enrollment rates in the presentation, and there are big gaps, especially at the secondary and tertiary level, in terms of enrollment rates between refugees and globally. And of course, these enrollment rates can be available at the country level, which we haven't shown you in this presentation, but that is something that is available and can be checked. Before I hand over to Karishma, I'd just like to say thank you very much. Thank you for allowing us to present, and thank you for allowing us to have an idea what kinds of questions people will come up with when we present our report. I note that the questions have focused a lot on the issue of quality of education. So maybe you're encouraging us to continue with our work and analysis and try to see if we can think about another report that does try to take into account issues around quality. So thanks again, and I hand over to Coach.
Yeah, thank you, Dina. I just wanted to second that. Thanks very much to the Japan Country Office team for hosting us and for giving us this opportunity to learn from your audience and also to present the findings of this paper. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. We had Dina Abu-Gaida, lead education specialist for Middle East and North Africa region in the Global Practice for Education, and Karishma Silva, economist in education global practice of the World Bank. Thank you very much for being with us this morning, presenting the report. Really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. Next week, we have 2 morning seminars backing our journey to future regional economic update. On Tuesday, April 13th, at 8 a.m. in Tokyo time, we are featuring Europe and Central Asia regional economic update. And Friday, April 16th at 8 a.m. in Tokyo time, we are featuring South Asia economic focus report. So please check our website for details of those seminars as well as other upcoming online seminars. With that, I'd like to once again thank you for viewing our seminars. Stay safe, stay healthy, and see you next week. Thank you very much.
I think Karishma disconnected. Are we off YouTube now?